Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the place where history gets weird, but the voice stays calm. Tonight we're wandering into one of humanity's most confusing subjects, sex. Not the kind with candlelight silk sheets and tasteful harp music. No, the medieval kind. The kind with straw, smoke, and a surprising amount of paperwork. But before you settle in and get cozy, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy falling asleep to the mistakes of our ancestors. And when you're ready, leave a comment telling where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own little corner of history. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background and allow your mind to wander. If your thoughts drift somewhere between theology and poor hygiene, don't worry. We'll be right there with you. Let's begin gently with a bed, a single room, and an idea of love that had to share space with everyone else. You probably imagine medieval love the way painters and poets do. A candlelit room, soft music, and two people falling into each other's arms under a carved wooden canopy. That's charming. It's also nonsense. In truth, most medieval homes had one room, one bed, and roughly the same number of people as a small village council. Husbands, wives, children, servants, and sometimes even travellers, all sleeping side by side in a pile that could only be called intimate if you ignored the smell. The straw mattress was stuffed with old reeds and ambition. The family goat occasionally joined in. The air was a mixture of smoke, sweat, and cabbage. Privacy, as a concept, hadn't yet been invented. If you wanted to be discreet, you waited until the children rolled over or the dog lost interest. For the poor, love was a matter of scheduling. For the rich, it was a matter of witnesses. Servants often stood by the bed on wedding nights, not out of romance, but as legal proof that the union had been productive. It's hard to be swept away by passion when someone is holding a candle and taking notes. Of course, not all intimacy happened at home. Inns offered travellers a place to rest, and a place to rest often meant sharing a mattress with strangers. If you arrived late, you might squeeze in between a merchant and a snoring farmer. In that setting, whispering sweet nothings was less about seduction, and more about making sure you didn't end up with the blanket. Still, people tried. There are letters, ballads, and tiny hints of tenderness that slip through the noise. A peasant husband writing from a distant field might promise to bring home a new wool blanket. A wife might hide a sprig of rosemary under the pillow for warmth and for hope. Even amid the chaos, they found their quiet ways. Then came the problem of comfort, or the lack of it. The bed wasn't a soft escape. It was a lumpy battlefield between splinters and fleas. Sheets were rarely washed, partly because water was work and partly because soap was expensive. Clothes doubled as blankets. Removing them all for passion was both impractical and unnecessary. When medieval paintings show lovers half-dressed, it isn't for modesty, it's for warmth. And yet, for all the inconvenience, there was an odd kind of equality in it. Everyone smelled roughly the same. Nobles and peasants alike lived in a world where perfume covered sweat, not replaced it. Love, in this sense, was truly democratic. It made no distinction between class, comfort, or odour. In courtly literature, poets spoke of chaste affection, of knights and ladies exchanging glances across gardens. But real life preferred the practical version. You smell less like onions today, let's get married. Romance was a luxury item, imported from France, and affordable only to those with time to daydream. Still, desire persisted, not as the fiery indulgence we imagine, but as a stubborn survival instinct. Between the sermons, the chores, and the cold, it was one of the few free pleasures left. And though the church called it dangerous, people still found time to sin quietly, responsibly, and with a certain medieval humility. If you listen closely to the chronicles, you'll find a kind of dry humour about it all. One bishop complained that peasants sinned without elegance. Another noted that the beds of the righteous are crowded, and yet temptation fits easily between the blankets. Even the saints, it seems, couldn't resist turning lust into poetry. So when you picture the Middle Ages, try not to see roses and velvet. Picture something closer to a smoky room, a flickering fire, and two people stealing a moment of warmth in a world that rarely offered any. No violin music, just the soft rhythm of breath and the crackle of wood, the quiet sound of survival disguised as affection. In that dim, shared space, love wasn't an escape from the world. It was a small rebellion inside it. And as we drift further into the story, the scene around the bed begins to widen. Beyond the whispers and the warmth, another power waits. One that decided when, how, and even if that love could happen at all. Hey there! Welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history loses its manners, but you don't have to. Tonight we're exploring one of humanity's most endlessly awkward subjects, intimacy. Not the kind sung about in pop ballads or painted with too much lighting. We're talking about the medieval kind, the smoky, crowded, faintly cabbage-scented version that somehow kept the species alive. But before you settle in and get cozy, please take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy falling asleep to humanity's long list of bad decisions. And when you're ready, leave a comment telling where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own little corner of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and make yourself comfortable. If your mind drifts, that's perfectly fine. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story, one blanket, one superstition, and one poor architectural choice at a time. So take a deep breath, let the modern world fade, and step into a time when privacy was scandalous, theology was detailed, and foreplay began with negotiating who got the side of the bed nearest the fire. When you picture love in the Middle Ages, you probably imagine candlelight, soft music, and the slow untying of silk ribbons. Unfortunately, medieval architecture had other ideas. A typical home had one room, one bed, and roughly 6 people sharing it. Parents, children, servants, and occasionally travellers, all piled together like laundry that refused to fold itself. The straw mattress was lumpy, the sheets were never quite clean, and if you were lucky, the family goat kept to its side of the room. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the faint memory of cabbage soup. Privacy wasn't a right. It was an experiment that hadn't been invented yet. If you wanted intimacy, you needed strategy. Some couples waited until everyone else was asleep. Others just pulled the blanket a little higher and hoped no one made eye contact. Peasants had to be practical, nobles had to be discreet. Either way, passion had to share space with spectators. For the wealthy, the problem wasn't smaller, just better documented. On wedding nights, servants stood by the bed with candles to act as official witnesses. This wasn't romance, it was a legal formality. The marriage had to be consummated, a word that sounds elegant until you realise it meant someone was there to confirm it happened. Imagine making eye contact with your notary at that moment. The Middle Ages were good at many things, but emotional subtlety was not one of them, and yet people cared deeply. They wrote about longing, about absence, about the small gestures that carried meaning. A wife might leave a sprig of rosemary under the pillow for love or luck. A husband, travelling for work or war, might send a token, a ribbon, a lock of hair, a promise scrawled in shaky ink. Love existed, just not the cinematic version. It was quieter, smaller, and usually tired. Beds, too, had their own social life. Inns, for example, offered what they called a bed for the night. What they meant was a section of a bed currently occupied by strangers. You might find yourself between a merchant, a farmer, and a monk who snored like a theological statement. If you managed to sleep, it was a miracle. If you managed romance, it was divine intervention. Hygiene didn't help. Bathing was an event, not a habit, and laundry day required an available river, and a saint's patience. Clothes doubled as pyjamas and occasionally as armour against fleas. If a painting from the period shows lovers half-dressed, it isn't for modesty. It's because undressing was a winter sport no one volunteered for. Still, there was something oddly democratic about desire in that world. Everyone smelled roughly the same. Everyone worked, sweated, and endured the same winters. Love wasn't divided by class or cosmetics. It was united by shared discomfort. When a man said, "You take my breath away," it was probably literal. The air inside was that bad. The church, meanwhile, observed all this with great anxiety and greater precision. Every sermon warned of lust's dangers, every saint wrote about chastity, and yet, here humanity still was, breeding industriously beneath the crucifix. Moral panic met biological persistence, and biology won every time. Even the saints seemed to notice the futility. One monk complained that the peasants in his parish sinned without elegance. Another declared that temptation fit too easily between the blankets. History's great secret is that even holiness had a sense of humour. And behind the jokes and prohibitions was a strange tenderness. Because despite the sermons and the smell, people found connection. They held hands under coarse linen sheets. They whispered across shared pillows. They carved hearts into wooden beams that still survive in half-timbered houses today. Love was not an escape from the world. It was resistance within it. If you stripped away the superstition, the church decrees, and the bad plumbing, what you'd find underneath was something familiar. Two people trying to make the best of a bad situation, inventing warmth in a world that was mostly cold. So yes, love existed. It just came wrapped in wool, watched by servants, and interrupted by livestock. And somehow, through all of it, humanity carried on. Proof that even in an age of dirt floors and divine rules, affection can still find a way to breathe. As we drift further into the story, the air around this smoky room starts to change. You'll soon discover that love wasn't just private, it was supervised. There were calendars for desire, laws for lust, and a moral schedule for when you were allowed to enjoy being human at all. If you thought the medieval bedroom was complicated, wait until you see the schedule. In our modern world, desire is mostly a private matter. Back then, it was public policy. The church didn't just have opinions about what you did, it had a timetable. Imagine hanging a calendar on your wall, not to plan holidays or harvests, but to mark the days you were officially allowed to be affectionate. Mondays were fine, unless they weren't. Fridays were forbidden, obviously. Lent, Advent, feast days, saint days, vigils, all banned. Even certain phases of the moon were discouraged. By the time you crossed out every prohibited date, half the year had vanished into holiness. The reasoning, at least on paper, was spiritual hygiene. The body was a noble vessel, the church said, but also an unpredictable one. Too much pleasure could tilt it towards sin. So they divided the calendar into sacred time and other time. The trick was remembering which was which. Priests, confessors, and theologians filled entire manuscripts with details. They wrote penitential manuals, essentially moral instruction books disguised as spreadsheets for the soul. Each sin came with its own line item, what you did, when you did it, and how many days you'd need to fast to make up for it. The result looked suspiciously like an early form of accounting. The medieval world turned desire into a ledger, not measured in gold but in guilt. In theory, this was about moral order. In practice, it was about control. When everything from your diet to your bedroom required clerical permission, confession became both therapy and surveillance. Priests asked questions most modern couples wouldn't ask each other. Did you approach your spouse with lust? Did you enjoy it? How much? In what position? Was there singing? It's easy to laugh, but this system wasn't born out of sadism. It came from genuine fear. The fear that pleasure, if left unsupervised, would open the door to chaos. The human body was seen as a battlefield where angels and demons fought for influence, and every act of love risked tipping the balance, the church tried to manage that risk with lists. Humanity tried to comply, or at least to appear as though it was trying. For peasants who had neither the time nor the literacy to follow all this, the rules became background noise. They sinned, confessed, and sinned again, in a rhythm as predictable as the changing seasons. Sin, in other words, was part of the economy. For clergy, it was job security. Even nobles found the contradictions exhausting. Chronicles record kings confessing their excess of marital enthusiasm and begging forgiveness for the crime of affection. The irony was obvious. The church needed marriages to produce heirs, but wanted the act itself to feel like a chore. Desire had to exist, just without enjoyment. A strange paradox, but one that fit perfectly into medieval logic, where suffering was proof of sincerity. And so, love became a kind of seasonal crop. It was planted carefully, tended with restraint, and harvested with guilt. Husbands and wives kept mental notes, not during Lent, not on Fridays, not when fasting, not on feast days, not near church festivals, not if a saint happened to be watching, which according to doctrine was always. You might think this level of restriction would make people miserable. It probably did. But it also produced a certain creativity. Records hint at couples negotiating exceptions. Quiet evenings after confession, or mornings before sunrise, when holiness was still half asleep. The human instinct to bend the rules was as old as the rules themselves. A priest could preach purity for an hour and still end up blessing a baby 9 months later with suspicious timing. The church, for its part, tried to outsmart human nature by emphasizing the idea of the marital debt. Each partner owed the other intimacy when requested, not as pleasure, but as duty. The Latin phrase was debitum conjugal, which sounds elegant until you realize it basically meant, you owe me because God said so. It was one of the few areas in which medieval law recognized a kind of gender balance. A wife could demand it just as a husband could. It was, in its way, the most egalitarian part of the whole system. Two people equally trapped in the same moral contract. Of course, this legal symmetry didn't always translate into kindness. The line between obligation and consent was blurred and sometimes erased entirely. Church courts occasionally heard cases of coercion within marriage, rare but not unheard of. These cases reveal that even in an age ruled by dogma, some people quietly recognized the difference between duty and cruelty. Still, most of the time, the balance held through habit rather than law. The faithful learned to adapt. They prayed for forgiveness, blamed the devil, and carried on. After all, if you believed the devil was responsible for temptation, then giving in was practically an act of victimhood. You couldn't be entirely guilty for something cosmic. Some confessional guides even included absurdly specific categories, a sign that the priests writing them had spent far too much time thinking about what they forbade. Reading those lists today feels like reading a 10th century search history. There's fascination, disgust, and a trace of curiosity that no amount of incense can erase. And through all of it, the ordinary rhythms of life continued. Farmers rose before dawn, bakers kneaded their bread, children shouted in the mud. Somewhere among all that, two people still found time to reach for each other. Between the sermons and the fasting days, between duty and desire. They might have called it sin, but it felt a lot like being alive. The church kept writing its rules, generation after generation, and humanity kept quietly editing them. The result was a truce, not between good and evil, but between belief and biology. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The soft sound of parchment being filled with guilt, and the even softer sound of two people pretending not to notice. Our quiet exploration now turns toward what those relationships actually looked like in practice. The contracts, the alliances, and the practical marriages that grew out of all this moral arithmetic. By now you might be wondering how anyone managed to get married at all. The short answer is, paperwork. Medieval marriage wasn't built on romance, or even on love at first sight. It was built on signatures, witnesses, and the subtle art of negotiation. You didn't fall in love. You entered into it carefully as though it were a business deal, which for most people it was. Marriage wasn't just about affection, it was about property, land, alliances, and sometimes livestock. Love could wait. What mattered first was the dowry, the witnesses, and whether your family would still have a roof over its head when the ink dried. If you were a peasant, your choices were usually limited to who lived within walking distance and who could tolerate the smell of your job. For the middle class, tradesmen, bakers, small landholders, things became more formal. Promises to marry were often made in front of neighbours or written down by a local priest long before the wedding itself. In some cases, a handshake and the right words were enough to make the union legally binding. Imagine the pressure of small talk when one wrong sentence could turn into a lifetime commitment. The church insisted that marriage was a holy sacrament, but it also insisted on treating it like a contract. Love was nice, but consent and witnesses were non-negotiable. You couldn't just elope without permission, at least not without causing a scandal. By the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council had even ruled that marriages had to be announced publicly before they happened. The purpose was to prevent secret unions and accidental incest, but it also gave the neighbours something to gossip about for weeks. The whole community was involved, whether they wanted to be or not. Parents arranged the matches, friends spread the news, and priests recorded the details. Weddings were less about two hearts joining and more about two families merging their assets. You might receive a dowry, a sum of money, a few animals, or perhaps a well-used cooking pot, but you were also acquiring in-laws, debts, and responsibilities. In a sense, it was the medieval version of a merger. Everyone smiled for the announcement, and no one read the fine print. For women, marriage offered protection, but rarely freedom. A wife's property usually passed to her husband, along with her legal identity. Yet within that limitation, women often found quiet ways to assert themselves. They managed the household, controlled the purse, and influenced family decisions in ways that rarely made it into the written records. Behind every Stoic husband in a chronicle, there was probably a wife running the budget with ruthless precision. Courtship, such as it was, tended to involve less poetry and more logistics. Families would meet to negotiate terms while the potential couple exchanged awkward glances from across the room. Physical attraction might be a pleasant surprise, but compatibility was measured in acres and alliances. The first thing most people asked about a potential spouse wasn't, "Do you love them?" It was, "Can they plough?" Still, affection found its way in. Even in the most pragmatic arrangements, couples sometimes grew genuinely close. Letters from the late Middle Ages show small, tender phrases between husbands and wives who began their marriages as strangers. They speak of care, of companionship, of the quiet trust built over years. Love, it turned out, could be retroactive. You didn't start with it, you earned it. Of course, not every union was peaceful. The church viewed marriage as indissoluble, meaning divorce was nearly impossible. Separation could happen under extreme circumstances, but it was rare. If your spouse was cruel, lazy, or simply insufferable, you were expected to pray for patience. "Till death do us part" wasn't poetic, it was a legal exit clause. That said, the system wasn't entirely heartless. In some places, a woman could petition the local bishop to intervene if her husband refused to support her, disappeared, or failed to perform his marital duties. Yes, even in the 14th century, there were recorded cases of wives demanding the enforcement of the conjugal debt. The church may have been moralistic, but it also believed strongly in mutual obligation, a surprisingly progressive concept hidden under layers of incense. The rituals themselves reflected this balance between duty and hope. The ceremony wasn't yet confined to a church. It often took place at the doorway of the home or the parish courtyard. There, in front of witnesses, the couple would join hands, exchange vows, and be publicly declared husband and wife. It was less about divine mystery and more about transparency. If you said it where everyone could hear you, you couldn't pretend later that it hadn't happened. Afterward came the feast, sometimes grand, sometimes meagre, but always loud. There would be music, ale and toasts, followed by the traditional bedding ceremony, which sounds romantic until you realise it involved spectators. In noble households, guests escorted the couple to the marriage bed, reciting blessings and throwing nuts or coins for fertility. Some even lingered long enough to verify that the marriage had been officially consummated. There were witnesses, laughter and more ale, not exactly the privacy you might hope for, but at least the witnesses were usually too drunk to remember the details. For the common people, the rituals were simpler, but the symbolism was the same. A shared meal, a promise before God, and a community watching closely enough to make sure neither side backed out. It all sounds transactional, and it was, but that doesn't mean it was loveless. Within these boundaries, people still laughed, quarrelled, shared chores, and grew old together. Marriage was rarely an escape from reality. It was an agreement to face reality with company. So when you think about medieval love, imagine not a fairy tale kiss under a castle window, but two people standing in a muddy courtyard hand in hand, with half the village watching. There's no music, no moonlight, just a shared sense that this is life, and it's better faced together than alone. If we follow the thread a little further, this partnership leads us to another kind of control. Not legal or financial this time, but physical. Because behind the myths of love and duty, there were also myths of protection, purity, and the impossible idea of locking temptation away. If you've ever heard the story of the chastity belt, that infamous iron contraption said to keep wandering hands at bay, here's the truth. It's a myth, and not even a particularly good one. There are museums filled with such devices, most of them built centuries later as curiosities or dark jokes for tourists. The idea that medieval husbands locked up their wives before going to war was more fantasy than fact, an exaggeration born from Renaissance satire and Victorian moral panic. The real tools of control were far subtler and far more effective. They didn't involve iron or locks, only shame, surveillance and religion. Society itself was the belt, and it fit tightly. A woman's reputation was the most fragile form of currency. Losing it could mean social exile, poverty, or worse. Every village had its chorus of observers, neighbours, priests, midwives, and busybodies who measured virtue by rumour. There was no privacy, not even for the virtuous. If a woman smiled too freely, if she walked unescorted, or if she lingered too long near a man who wasn't her husband, her name could become a sermon topic by the following Sunday. Virginity for the unmarried wasn't just expected, it was proof of value. Among nobles, it was a legal guarantee for inheritance. Among peasants, it was a matter of dignity and marriage prospects. The first night of marriage often came with an unsettling ritual of verification. Sheets were displayed, midwives inspected, and witnesses whispered. It wasn't romance, it was quality control. And while men enjoyed the luxury of sin with minimal scandal, women lived under the constant possibility of being found out, even if nothing had happened at all. The church's stance was consistent. Chastity was holy, desire was dangerous, and sin was lurking just under the bedsheets. The Virgin Mary was upheld as the perfect model. Pure, obedient, silent. It was a high bar to set for anyone still trying to survive winter without central heating. Of course, the irony ran deep. While sermons preached restraint, entire industries quietly profited from lust. Towns licensed brothels, collected taxes, and wrote hygiene rules for prostitutes. The logic was as twisted as it was pragmatic. Better to manage sin than to eradicate it. Brothels, in the church's eyes, acted as safety valves, protecting respectable women by giving men an acceptable outlet. It was, in short, moral accounting. Sin was tolerated as long as it could be counted, taxed, and contained. And yet, within these brothels, the women lived on a delicate edge. They were shamed publicly but needed privately. Some worked by choice, many by survival. Cities like Avignon and Toulouse even had official brothel keepers on the municipal payroll, responsible for maintaining order and collecting rent. The contradiction was so open that it barely counted as hypocrisy anymore. It was just business. For ordinary women outside these walls, the control mechanisms were constant but invisible. Clothing codes dictated modesty. Sleeves long, necklines high, hair covered. Even colour had meaning. A bright hue could imply vanity, a dark one submission. To be respectable, you had to perform restraint at all times. That performance often required exhausting effort. Still, people were people. There are letters, court records, and confessions that hint at the small rebellions that slipped through the cracks. Secret meetings, coded phrases, and carefully timed encounters. A walk for air might mean something entirely different if you were young, in love, and accompanied by the wrong person. The fact that so many of these stories ended in the archives of church courts shows that they happened frequently enough to cause administrative fatigue. It wasn't just women under scrutiny, men too faced expectations to remain honourable, to control their impulses, to prove moral leadership. But the consequences of failure were rarely equal. For a man, sin was a lapse. For a woman, it was a label. And then there were the saints, the church's gold standard examples of purity. Stories of women who rejected suitors, renounced marriage, or performed miraculous acts of chastity filled religious texts. Some starved themselves to maintain virtue, others disfigured their faces to avoid attention. It's difficult to know how much of this was history and how much was storytelling, but the message was clear. The ideal woman was untouched and preferably silent. There's a strange comfort, though, in realizing how inconsistent the entire system was. The same society that exalted virginity also celebrated fertility. Women were supposed to be both pure and prolific, a contradiction that no sermon could reconcile. To be too cold was unloving, to be too warm was sinful. The line was thin and usually drawn by someone else. As for the chastity belts displayed in museums today, the polished iron cages with hinges and locks, most were made hundreds of years after the Middle Ages. Some were satire, others cautionary props from travelling morality exhibits. In reality, no one wanted to deal with the hygiene disaster such a device would cause. You didn't need steel to suppress desire. Fear did the job well enough. So the next time someone jokes about medieval purity or iron underwear, remember that the truth was more psychological than mechanical. The real restraint was woven into daily life, in sermons, in gossip, in expectations whispered from mother to daughter. It was a world where reputation mattered more than truth, and where control disguised itself as protection. And yet, even under that weight, affection persisted. Lovers met at night under church eaves. Letters travelled by candlelight, tucked into hymnals and delivered by sympathetic servants. There were risks, always, but also the quiet thrill of surviving them. For every sermon on sin, there was a love note hidden in a psalm. In a way, that's what makes this period so human. The rules were absurd, but the feelings weren't. People wanted to be good, but also to be loved. And sometimes those two ambitions didn't cooperate. If we follow the thread a little further, those contradictions lead us beyond morality and into the marketplace, to the places where desire was not hidden but organised, taxed and inspected, where love became labour and sin paid rent. In every medieval town there was a district where morality and necessity shook hands. It wasn't hidden away in the shadows as much as you might imagine. In fact, it was often right next to the baker or the blacksmith. They called it the public house of women, a phrase that somehow managed to sound both official and evasive. Brothels were not a secret embarrassment. They were civic infrastructure. Cities licensed them, taxed them, and sometimes even built them. For the church and local authorities, it was the same reasoning they used for drainage systems. unpleasant but necessary. People they believed would always sin. Better that sin had an address. This system was called regulated vice, a phrase that could also describe half of medieval politics. The logic was simple. Contain desire, keep it off the streets, and you keep order. So towns drew up rules. Brothels could only operate within certain walls, away from churches but close enough for supervision. The women had to register their names. The keeper, often a man of middle age and flexible ethics, paid a monthly fee to the city. Everyone knew who they were, and no one pretended otherwise. It's strange to think that the same society that preached chastity on Sunday was counting brothel taxes by Thursday. But the contradiction didn't bother them much. To their minds, this was moral engineering, sin quarantined for the common good. The church framed it as a lesser evil, a way to protect honest women from temptation. The theologian Thomas Aquinas compared prostitution to a sewer, unpleasant but vital. Without it, he said, society would overflow with lust. It's not the kind of metaphor you'd want on a statue, but it worked for city councils trying to justify the budget. Inside these houses, life followed its own quiet logic. The women were called public daughters, a title meant to imply shame but also dependence. They lived under curfews and dress codes, sometimes forced to wear yellow scarves or striped veils so they could be recognised, as if sin had a uniform. Their earnings were split with the keeper and taxed by the town. For many, the work wasn't a choice, but neither was starvation. A brothel offered food, a roof and protection, of a sort. It was survival in ledger form. Visitors came from all classes, young apprentices, travelling merchants, even clerics found their way there. In one French record, a bishop fined his own chaplain for over-frequent devotion at the house of pleasure. Hypocrisy wasn't rare, it was tradition. The same men who condemned vice publicly often supported it privately, and if caught, they had one simple defence: confession. Forgiveness was always on sale, right next to indulgences. Still, there were attempts to enforce morality. Inspectors, a kind of medieval health board, sometimes visited brothels to check cleanliness, or at least the absence of plague. They ordered new straw for the beds, washed linens, and periodic fumigations with herbs. If that sounds oddly progressive, remember it wasn't about compassion. It was about public health. Lust, they believed, was inevitable, but contagion was preventable. The atmosphere inside these establishments probably varied from city to city. Some brothels were dim and crude, more survival shelter than den of pleasure. Others, especially in wealthier towns like Florence or Avignon, resembled small inns with music, wine, and decorum. The line between entertainment and intimacy blurred. Musicians played the lute, jokes were traded, and deals were made in the same breath as flirtations. The brothel was a social space, awkward, transactional, and oddly familiar. Not all women stayed forever. Some saved enough money to leave, marry, or start small shops of their own. A few even became brothel keepers, turning survival into management. Others were trapped by debt or coercion, their lives lost in the margins of city ledgers. You can still find their names scribbled between tax records and morality fines, brief, practical notes about lives that never got their own stories. And yet, amid the exploitation and the hypocrisy, there were glimpses of humanity. Letters between brothel workers and their lovers have survived in fragments. One woman wrote, "I live in sin, but my heart is my own." It's a small sentence, but it tells you everything. Behind the walls built to contain vice, people still hoped, still felt, still believed in something softer than survival. For all its contradictions, the medieval brothel was also a mirror. It reflected a world terrified of desire and yet sustained by it. The church could condemn lust, but its cathedrals still depended on the taxes paid by sinners. The same economy that funded saints' relics also funded clean sheets for the public daughters. And no one saw the irony because irony was simply how life worked. Morality was elastic. A knight could attend mass at dawn and visit a brothel by dusk. A priest could write a sermon on purity while negotiating rent with the madam next door. As long as sin stayed within its boundaries, the world remained balanced. But balance never lasts. By the 15th century, reformers began to turn against the system. The moral tone shifted, diseases spread, new laws closed many brothels. The Reformation would later denounce them entirely. Yet even as the buildings emptied, the logic survived. The idea that desire needed management, that pleasure required permission, that never really left. If you strip away the incense and Latin, what remains is a remarkably familiar story. Humans made rules about their own instincts, broke them almost immediately, and then invented bureaucracy to pretend it was under control. In the end, everyone played along. The sinner, the saint, and the tax collector, each pretending their role made sense. So when we look back on this paradox of purity and profit, it's tempting to laugh. But there's a strange melancholy too, because underneath the moral math was a truth the medieval world never quite admitted, that no amount of rules, locks, or taxes could make desire less human. And as we drift further into the story, that humanity begins to take on a new form, one that smells less of incense and more of soap. For now, the scene leaves the crowded marketplace and moves toward water, toward the rituals of cleansing and the odd ways people try to stay pure inside and out. You might imagine that, after all this talk of sin, the medieval world was a place obsessed with washing away guilt. It was, but only spiritually. When it came to the body, washing was considered a suspicious hobby. Bathing was a complicated subject. Everyone agreed that water could cleanse the soul through baptism, but they weren't so sure it should cleanse the rest of you. The logic was partly medical and partly moral. Physicians of the time believed that warm water opened the pores and weakened the body. Priests worried it opened temptation. Either way, being too clean was considered risky. The average person bathed rarely. A peasant might wash their hands and face every few days, or rinse in a stream after work, but a full bath was an event. Soap was expensive, tubs were awkward, and heating water required chopping, hauling, and praying the fire didn't go out halfway. You didn't strip down lightly in a world where winter lasted half the year, and privacy was as rare as hot water. When people did bathe, it was often social. Towns had bathhouses, the precursors of public spas, where men and women sometimes shared space, separated only by thin screens or good manners. Not surprisingly, the church disapproved. Bathhouses became the target of moral panic, accused of being dens of impurity. Some closed, others adapted by hanging crosses on the walls, as if a bit of sacred decor could keep desire from steaming up the room. Yet cleanliness had its own hierarchy. The wealthy had the luxury of perfumed baths, wooden tubs lined with linen, and servants to pour heated water. They used herbal mixtures, rosemary, thyme, mint, both for fragrance and because medical theory said they balanced the body's inner humours. To the medieval mind, health was a matter of balance between heat, cold, dryness, and moisture. If you sweated too much, your bile rose. If you drank too much wine, your blood overheated. The body was basically a fragile recipe that could curdle without notice. The poor, meanwhile, improvised. A wooden bucket, a rag, and a patch of daylight near the hearth was enough. They used ashes or lye for scrubbing, effective but harsh. Some rinsed with cold water mixed with vinegar, which probably worked, if only because it killed enthusiasm for bathing again soon. Clothing helped to mask the lack of hygiene. Layers of wool and linen trapped both heat and odour. It was said that a truly noble person could be recognised by their perfume, or at least by how skillfully it covered everything else. The mixture of sweat and flowers was practically a social class in itself. But washing wasn't only about dirt, it was about morality. The word clean meant both physically and spiritually pure. A spotless soul mattered more than spotless skin. People went to confession more often than they went to the bath. You could neglect your body but not your conscience. A muddy tunic was forgivable, an unconfessed thought was not. And yet humans are stubbornly consistent. They may have feared water, but they still liked feeling fresh. Some turned washing into ritual. Before meals, hands were rinsed from a shared basin, not just for hygiene, but as a sign of civility. The upper classes owned ornate ewers and bowls for this purpose, often made of brass or silver, because virtue always looks better when it shines. Guests were impressed, and hands, at least, were briefly clean. There were exceptions, of course. Medieval Japan and the Islamic world both embraced bathing as a moral and physical good, and their travellers often commented on how little Europeans washed. An Arab visitor to 12th century Spain once wrote that Christians bathe only at birth and upon their death. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't far off either. Even the saints struggled with this paradox. Some holy figures avoided bathing entirely as a sign of humility, believing the stench of the flesh was a reminder of mortality. Others, more practical, saw cleanliness as godliness and encouraged bathing in moderation. Between them, ordinary people did what humans always do. They ignored the extremes and washed when it seemed necessary. Still, certain festivals revived the habit. On midsummer nights, people bathed in rivers for luck. On Easter, they washed to symbolize renewal. These acts blurred the line between medicine, religion, and superstition. Water might cure, bless, or protect, depending on who you asked. The bathhouse, despite its scandals, remained popular where it survived. Couples went there together, families rented rooms, and travelling merchants recovered from the road in hot pools that probably smelled of herbs and regret. City ordinances tried to keep things decent. No mixed bathing after sunset, no singing, no gambling. The fact that such rules had to exist tells you how often they were ignored. If you wandered into one of these places, you'd see a mix of classes sharing the same steam. Merchants, monks, tailors, and thieves, all equalised by the fog. You might hear political gossip or the latest rumour about a saint's miracle. Someone would be scrubbing their back with a bundle of twigs. Someone else would be debating theology in a towel. It was hygiene as theatre, where bodies and souls both pretended to be purified. The church never fully won its battle against bathing, but it did leave a lasting suspicion. Cleanliness remained associated with vanity, dirt with humility. Even centuries later, noble ladies would still faint at the suggestion of too much soap. It would take the rediscovery of Roman plumbing and a few epidemics to convince Europe that washing might actually be a form of healthcare. For now, though, the medieval citizen did what was necessary. They prayed often, washed rarely, and sprayed herbs on everything in between. It wasn't elegant, but it was efficient. So, if you ever complain about running out of hot water, remember, you're still living a luxury that would have seemed suspicious in the 13th century. As we follow the thread a little further, this uneasy relationship with cleanliness leads us into an even stranger territory, the science of prevention. Because when bathing was frowned upon and confession couldn't cure everything, people started turning to herbs, spells, and strange ingredients, all in the desperate hope of keeping love and life under control. If you've ever wondered how people in the Middle Ages tried to avoid pregnancy, the answer is creatively, desperately, and with a deep misunderstanding of biology. In a world where bathing too often was seen as suspicious, the idea of family planning involved equal parts superstition, folklore, and blind optimism. There was no shortage of advice. Some of it came from midwives and herbal healers, much of it from word of mouth whispered in kitchens or shared over the grinding of grain. The church, of course, banned all of it, which meant people tried anyway. One common approach was herbal concoctions. There were plants that people swore by: rue, pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, and juniper. Some were brewed into teas, others chewed, and a few rubbed onto the skin with uncertain results. The logic was simple. If it tasted awful, it must be doing something powerful. It's the same reasoning that keeps cough syrup in business today. Pennyroyal, for instance, was believed to cool the womb. It did, mostly because it was mildly toxic. Many of these remedies were dangerous not because people were foolish, but because they had nothing else to rely on. Medicine was still half magic, half observation, and mostly luck. Other methods were even stranger. Linen soaked in herbal mixtures was used as a primitive barrier. Wax was moulded into shapes meant to seal virtue. Amulets were worn around the neck, tiny charms of copper, bone, or carved wood inscribed with prayers or symbols. The logic behind these charms was less chemical and more cosmic. If God could protect crops from hail and ships from storms, surely he could protect a couple from consequences. Then there were the rituals, the kind that sound like poetry until you remember they were meant as birth control. Some texts advised women to jump backward after intimacy exactly 9 times, chanting the name of a saint between each leap. Others said to sneeze forcefully or hold one's breath. One suggestion, preserved in a medical manual, warned that if a woman walks backward 3 steps before looking at the moon, she will remain barren for the month. Science at this point had wandered off to take a nap. Of course, the church took a dim view of all this experimentation. Official doctrine declared that every act of intimacy must remain open to the possibility of new life. Anything else was sin. But nature doesn't consult theologians, and survival doesn't pause for sermons. When the harvest failed, or a family already had more mouths to feed than hands to work, people quietly ignored doctrine. The need to control one's future was too powerful to be silenced entirely. There was, however, a price to pay if caught. The punishments varied: fines, public penance, or a stern talking to from a priest who probably had no practical experience with the topic. But enforcement was inconsistent. Peasants were often judged by results. If a baby arrived, God had clearly forgiven them. If not, the sin was harder to prove. Even the clergy admitted that temptation was universal. One confessor, writing in the 14th century, noted with weary resignation that married couples often sin through prevention, and yet they are not devils. It was as close as medieval theology ever came to shrugging. Behind these old recipes and prohibitions lies something quietly moving, a form of hope. People weren't trying to rebel against God as much as they were trying to survive him. A mother who had lost 3 children to famine might pray to avoid another pregnancy, not from selfishness, but from mercy. A young couple just starting out might whisper over a charm in the dark, not out of wickedness, but fear. Each strange potion or whispered spell was an act of love disguised as desperation. You can almost picture it. A woman grinding herbs at dawn, her hand steady, her mind racing between faith and fear. The air smells sharp. Mint, sage, vinegar. She murmurs a verse she half remembers from Mass, hoping it still counts if she's technically sinning. A man waits by the door, pretending not to watch. Both of them aware that this small ritual carries more risk than comfort. Some of these folk remedies worked by accident. Others did nothing at all. But they gave people a sense of control in a world where control was rare. And that might have been the real medicine. Because belief itself, the feeling that you could do something, was often what kept people going. Even centuries later, doctors and historians would rediscover some truth in those old recipes. Queen Anne's lace seeds, for example, do have mild contraceptive properties. Certain herbs really do affect hormones. The line between magic and medicine wasn't as thick as we like to imagine. It was mostly drawn in hindsight. Meanwhile, the church continued its moral tug-of-war, preaching chastity while quietly acknowledging reality. Priests wrote long confessional guides listing every possible sin related to sex. each one with a prescribed penance. Reading them today feels like scrolling through the world's most awkward manual, half warning, half curiosity. The irony, of course, is that in trying to document every forbidden act, they preserve the very knowledge they hope to erase. In the end, none of these efforts, not the rules, not the rituals, not the beaver testicle wine, could truly silence human nature. People still found ways to love each other, even if they had to invent small acts of rebellion to do it. And so, beneath the sermons and the smoke, there was always this undercurrent of human ingenuity. People trying, failing, laughing, whispering, and trying again. The medieval world may not have understood anatomy, but it understood persistence. If we follow the trail of that persistence, it leads us away from herbs and hope and into the public square, into a world of records, fines, and the curious bureaucracy of forgiveness. Because when sin became predictable, it also became something you could pay off, record neatly, and sometimes even undo. In the medieval world, sin had a price, not always eternal, sometimes just financial. If you slipped before marriage, or during it, or somewhere vaguely near it, there was a fine, a confession, and occasionally a wedding to fix it all retroactively. In short, morality had a billing department. The church didn't invent guilt, but it did perfect its paperwork. Parish clerks kept long lists of offences, who slept with whom, who got caught, who repented, and who could pay. They wrote everything down on parchment that smelled faintly of candle smoke and regret. Every mark of ink represented both a soul and a transaction. Premarital sex wasn't rare, it was simply inconvenient. In villages where everyone knew everyone, love couldn't stay secret for long. A suspicious pregnancy, a whispered confession, or a neighbour with excellent hearing could set the wheels of bureaucracy in motion. Church courts were filled with cases of carnal knowledge before wedlock. That's how they phrased it, as if affection could be filed alphabetically. But here's the twist. The church didn't always punish harshly. It preferred order over outrage. If a couple was already living together or clearly intended to marry, priests often looked the other way, or better yet, hurried them toward the altar. Love might have been premature, but a swift wedding turned sin into sacrament. There was even a word for it, handfasting, a sort of verbal engagement made by joining hands and promising fidelity. It could be blessed later when the priest had time. In essence, it was a moral shortcut. We're not sinning, we're just early. In towns and cities, things were more official. Local laws imposed fines, not for passion itself, but for scandal. This sin mattered less than its visibility. If no one talked, no one cared. If everyone talked, you paid. The fee varied. A few pennies for gossip-level offences, a whole silver mark for pregnancies that couldn't be ignored. Think of it as a medieval version of public relations damage control. What's oddly endearing is how forgiving these systems could be once money changed hands. Confess, pay, promise improvement, and you were back in good standing. It was less about holiness than about keeping records tidy. One English priest wrote that his parishioners sinned weekly and confessed fortnightly, which suggests a rather efficient rotation. The real power, though, belonged to gossip. Medieval villages were social ecosystems built on rumour. A raised eyebrow could destroy a reputation faster than a court ruling. Neighbours were the surveillance network of the age, listening through walls made of wattle and moral certainty. Every sneeze was a clue, every long walk a potential scandal. But there was also compassion in the chaos. When love produced an inconvenient child, the community often adapted. Godparents stepped in. Families rearranged duties. Weddings were organised quickly, with little talk of shame. After all, survival came first. A new pair of working hands mattered more than doctrinal timing. It wasn't all gentle tolerance, of course. Some towns staged public penance, a symbolic walk of shame through the streets, barefoot and holding candles. Others required couples to kneel before the church door while the congregation filed past. Yet even this was more performance than cruelty. Once the ritual was done, life resumed. The villagers went back to their fields, the priest went back to his ledgers, and the sinners went back to being ordinary people again. There's something quietly practical about it all. Medieval morality, for all its drama, was surprisingly flexible. The church might have thundered from the pulpit about purity, but down in the parish, forgiveness had a price list and office hours. The system worked because everyone understood it was less about erasing sin and more about keeping peace. And then there was the fascinating grey zone of informal marriage. If two people declared their vows privately, even without witnesses, the union could still be considered valid under church law. It was messy but binding. This led to centuries of arguments about who had promised what to whom. Court records overflow with disputes like, "He said we were married," and "No, I only said we might be." Love was complicated, and canon lawyers made a living sorting it out. Behind all these rules and fines was a kind of social logic. Marriage, after all, was less about romance than about stability. Every community depended on predictable households, legitimate heirs, and clear lines of inheritance. Sin threatened paperwork, not salvation. That's why even the most pious officials preferred repentance over punishment. It was simply more efficient. One account from 14th century York describes a couple fined for fornication in the barn. The priest noted with bureaucratic calm that they appeared contrite and were joined in lawful matrimony thereafter. You can almost hear the sigh in his ink. Another crisis resolved, another statistic added to divine accounting. And yet, despite all the judgment, humanity persisted. Behind every confession was a story, and behind every story a bit of warmth. People didn't stop loving just because it was risky. They adjusted. They whispered. They learned to navigate sin as carefully as they did the muddy roads after rain. The truth is, most people didn't think of themselves as rebels. They thought of themselves as ordinary, trying to live within the rules, bending them just enough to make life livable. In that sense, the medieval world wasn't much different from ours. The details change, the paperwork changes, but the quiet negotiation between love and law never really ends. So the next time you imagine a medieval sinner kneeling in repentance, remember the practical side. Somewhere nearby, a clerk is counting coins, a priest is updating his records, and a neighbour is already telling the story with slightly more detail than accuracy. Sin was rarely fatal, but gossip could last generations. Our path now carries us to a different kind of currency, one even more fragile than money or forgiveness. It was the proof of purity, the commodity of marriage markets, and the most precarious social investment a woman could hold: virginity. In the Middle Ages, virtue wasn't just a moral concept, it was a form of capital. And nowhere was that truer than in the matter of virginity. A woman's worth, her marriage prospects, and even her family's reputation could all hinge on a single question: had she remained untouched? The term untouched itself carried the weight of centuries. It meant purity, honour, and obedience all at once. To be pure was to be marriageable. To be marriageable was to be valuable. A man's virtue, by contrast, was rarely discussed unless he was a priest. Male experience added colour to his reputation. Female experience removed it entirely. Virginity was, in every sense, the medieval stock market. Volatile, overvalued, and entirely male-controlled. Families invested in it, gossips traded in it, and priests monitored its fluctuations with grim fascination. A daughter's chastity was not just her own, it was the family's public bond of credit. Among nobles, virginity came with property clauses. Marriage contracts explicitly stated the bride must arrive undefiled because inheritance required legitimacy. If a noblewoman's virtue came into question, the deal could collapse. Entire alliances could unravel over rumour alone. For poorer families, it was less about politics and more about survival. A daughter who stayed pure could secure a husband and with him a future. And then came the rituals of proof. After a wedding night, sheets might be inspected for bloodstains, a custom both intrusive and absurd. Midwives could be called in as witnesses, their experience used to confirm or deny the bride's innocence. Some families even displayed the sheets publicly, like a grotesque certificate of authenticity. The bride's body became evidence, and the community her jury. Of course, not every marriage fit this ideal. Love, desire, or simple curiosity often complicated things. Couples who had been too early sometimes staged theatrical delays, inventing reasons to postpone the wedding night until enough time had passed to make any child seem legitimate. The arithmetic of shame could be surprisingly precise. For widows and older women, chastity carried a different value. A widow who remained celibate was praised as virtuous, almost saintly. But a widow who remarried too quickly was accused of greed. The same act, loving again, could be read as either devotion or decadence, depending entirely on who was watching. The double standard was everywhere. Men could joke about seduction. Women could only pray for forgiveness. Even within religion, purity was always gendered. Male saints fought temptation. Female saints were defined by their ability to resist it. The highest praise for a woman was not what she did, but what she refused to do. In convents, the idea of virginity became almost mystical. Nuns were called brides of Christ. They wore rings symbolizing divine marriage and were considered spiritually wed to God himself. It was a life of prayer, service, and allegedly serenity. But chronicles hint that many entered convents not from divine calling, but from economic necessity. A dowry was often required even to join. Chastity, it seemed, came with an entrance fee. Meanwhile, outside the convent walls, ordinary women lived under constant watch. Fashion became another battlefield. If a neckline slipped too low or a skirt seemed too fine, accusations followed. A simple smile could be read as flirtation, a laugh at the wrong moment as proof of looseness. Reputation was fragile, and once cracked, it rarely healed. Yet within this harsh economy, women found subtle ways to reclaim control. Some played along, performing exaggerated modesty to disarm gossip. Others quietly ignored the rules and relied on friends, family, or quick marriages to patch reputations. Virginity might have been a public currency, but women still found private ways to spend it. There were even stories of deception that bordered on ingenuity. One tale from a 15th century chronicle tells of a bride who, having lost her virginity before marriage, used a small pouch of animal blood sewn beneath her gown to stain the sheets. It worked. The family celebrated her purity with music and wine. The chronicler's tone is dry but admiring, as if to say, well played. Such stories reveal not just moral tension but survival instinct. Virginity wasn't about virtue, it was about safety. In a world where a woman's future depended on her reputation, she couldn't afford honesty. Morality, like most currencies, was easier to counterfeit than to maintain. Still, not all purity was performative. Some women genuinely believed in the sanctity of chastity, as freedom, not burden. The mystic Marjorie Kempe, for instance, famously convinced her husband to take a vow of celibacy after bearing 14 children. Her neighbours mocked her, her confessor doubted her sanity, but she persisted, declaring her body belonged to God. In a way, she turned the entire system inside out, claiming choice in a world built on control. It's easy to mock these contradictions, but they reveal something deeply human. People were trying to make sense of love, faith, and fear in a world that left little room for mistakes. They built rules to contain what they couldn't predict, and then spent generations finding ways around them. The obsession with purity also left its mark on art and literature. Painters filled churches with images of the Virgin Mary, serene, immaculate, impossibly perfect. Her blue robe became the symbol of divine grace and unreachable virtue. Ordinary women looked up at her and saw both inspiration and impossibility. It was hard to compete with someone who'd managed motherhood without sin. Over time, virginity became less a personal state and more a cultural myth, an ideal everyone praised and few managed to live by. The tragedy wasn't that people failed to meet the standard, it was that they were judged for trying. By dawn, after the music faded and the sheets were folded, a medieval bride might lie awake listening to the bells of morning prayer. Outside, the town stirred, carts creaking, roosters crowing, gossip already beginning. Inside, the air was still. The proof had been shown, the honour preserved, and yet the silence afterward carried a question no ritual could answer. How much of herself had she really kept? Our quiet exploration now turns from this fragile economy of virtue toward what came next, the long tangled story of desire itself. Because behind all the rules, fines and proofs of purity, affection still persisted. And love, in its stubborn way, kept surviving every attempt to tame it. For all the church's rules, the whispered sermons and the embroidered sheets of proof, people still fell in love. Desire was a fact, as natural and unavoidable as hunger or cold. The miracle wasn't that it existed, it was that it survived everything built to suppress it. Love in the Middle Ages didn't come with flowers or sonnets for most people. It came with chores, frost and fatigue. Affection had to find room between hauling water and feeding animals. A kiss might happen while passing a bucket. A touch might be stolen near a doorway, quick as breath. In that sense, desire wasn't glamorous, it was stubborn. The church never stopped warning against it. Priests reminded their congregations that passion was dangerous, that pleasure was best approached with fear. One sermon recommended that married couples meet with moderation, without laughter, and only for necessity. In other words, once a month, and preferably without smiling. The message was clear. Affection was acceptable only when disguised as duty. Still, people knew better. They understood that warmth was as necessary as bread. It softened long winters and short tempers. Peasant songs, often unrecorded but occasionally written down by amused clerks, are full of teasing, flirtation, and unashamed longing. You can sense the rebellion in their humour, an ordinary joy that slipped between the cracks of doctrine. Adultery, of course, was another matter. When desire stepped outside marriage, things grew dangerous. For men, the risks were mostly social. For women, they could be catastrophic. Punishments ranged from fines and public confession to imprisonment or worse, depending on who you were and who you offended. But despite the risks, affairs happened everywhere. In royal courts, they even inspired poetry. Troubadours sang about courtly love, a polite fiction where knights adored married ladies from a distance, turning temptation into art. In practice, the distance wasn't always as long as advertised. The problem, as the church saw it, was not just sin but chaos. Passion ignored property lines, inheritance laws and social order. It was unpredictable. That made it dangerous. So theology did what theology often does. It tried to contain mystery inside a rulebook. Love, in its wildest form, was turned into something respectable through allegory. Poets compared it to divine longing. Preachers compared it to fire, useful when controlled, destructive when free. And yet, amid the fear and the fines, people found ways to care for one another. Letters from peasants and soldiers survive, rare, clumsy, full of spelling errors and sincerity. One man writes to his wife, "I send you my heart, which is sad without you." Another promises to bring her a comb and a little piece of lace if he returns from campaign. There's no art in these words, only need. You can almost hear the dirt under their nails as they write. In small villages, affection was practical. Couples who had endured famine and childbirth together built quiet tenderness out of endurance. There was rarely time for romance, but there was loyalty, humour, and shared survival. A farmer might tease his wife about her cooking. She might curse him for coming home muddy. Both knew they would wake up the next day and do it all again. It wasn't poetry, but it was love, written in chores instead of ink. Even celibacy, that celebrated ideal, proved complicated. Many who swore vows of chastity, priests, monks, and nuns, struggled to keep them. Records are filled with confessions, secret relationships, and the occasional scandal that reached the bishop's desk. The human body, it turned out, didn't always respect oaths. There are letters from repentant monks begging forgiveness for the sins of the flesh, written with a tone somewhere between shame and weary honesty. Behind the Latin phrases, you can hear the sigh of someone who expected holiness to be easier than it was. Over time, some writers began to argue that love itself wasn't the problem, only its excesses. They drew on ancient philosophers who saw moderation as virtue. The Stoics called it temperance, a balance between desire and reason. The Church rebranded it as marital harmony. But whether it came from Greece or Galilee, the idea was the same. Passion was dangerous, but not evil. Indulgence was folly, but so was denial. That middle path, though rarely walked perfectly, was the one most people lived by. Ordinary couples learned to navigate affection with the same patience they brought to ploughing fields. They quarrelled, reconciled, grew old together. The Church could preach restraint all it wanted. The body had its own calendar, and it refused to be quiet forever. It's easy, centuries later, to romanticize their restraint, to imagine simpler lives, tamer hearts. But the truth was more complex. These were people living at the edge of survival, balancing hunger, faith, fear, and affection in equal measure. They didn't have the luxury of purity or passion in isolation. They had to make both fit under the same roof. By the firelight of an ordinary home, you can almost see it. A couple sitting close, the day's labour behind them. Outside, the village sleeps under frost. Inside, they share a piece of bread, a cup of ale, a few words that might be teasing or tender. It's hard to tell. There's no poetry in the air, no witnesses, no rules being quoted. Just two people, tired but alive, and for the moment, content. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that desire always finds a shape to fit the times. It adapts to sermons, hides behind marriages, and slips past the rules meant to confine it. The Church tried to define it, the law tried to price it, but no one ever truly mastered it. Desire, like faith, is stubborn. It endures not because it's permitted, but because it's human. And as the embers fade in that quiet room, our story begins to shift. The crowded world of medieval beds and whispers gives way to open air, to thought rather than flesh. For a moment, we'll leave behind the noise of sin and confession and step into a different kind of discipline, one that sought to control not the body but the mind. Our story now leaves the cold rooms of medieval Europe and steps into the warmth of the Mediterranean sun, to a place where wisdom was once taught not in churches, but in open air. Here, among the marble columns of Athens, a shipwreck gave birth to a philosophy. His name was Zeno, a merchant from the city of Citium. He wasn't a saint or a prophet. He was simply a man who lost everything. Legend says that one stormy voyage left him stranded and broke. His cargo, the wealth he'd spent his life building, sank beneath the waves. When he washed ashore, he wandered into a bookshop because even in crisis, humans are drawn to distraction. There he found a scroll filled with the words of Socrates. He read, paused, and said to the bookseller, "Where can I find a man like this?" The answer changed history. "Follow me." That chance encounter led him to a teacher named Crates, who lived on little, argued a lot, and cared nothing for luxury. From him, Zeno learned that a good life doesn't depend on what you own, but on what you understand. Over time, Zeno began to teach his own ideas. He gathered followers not in temples, but under a painted porch in the marketplace, the Stoa Poikile, which simply means the colourful porch. From that spot, Stoicism was born. The word Stoic today suggests someone emotionless, but that's a misunderstanding. Zeno's philosophy wasn't about suppressing feelings, it was about understanding them, recognizing that fear, anger, and joy are part of life, but they don't have to steer the ship. The Stoic, he said, is like a sailor who cannot control the wind but can still set the sail. It's a comforting image, calm in the face of chaos, steering quietly through uncertainty. In that way, Stoicism was less a theory and more a survival skill. It didn't demand faith or ceremony, only awareness. At its heart was one simple distinction: what you can control and what you can't. You can't control storms, the opinions of others, or the passage of time. You can control your choices, how you think, how you speak, and how you act. The rest, Zeno said, is weather. This idea sounds obvious now, but in a world of gods, oracles, and fate, it was revolutionary. It offered peace not through prayer, but through perspective. If the gods are just, then all will be well. If they are not, then they aren't gods, and all will still be well, because reason itself remains. Zeno's students practiced what they called living according to nature, not in the sense of hugging trees, but in aligning one's actions with the quiet order of the universe. They believed that the world was guided by a kind of divine intelligence, a pattern, a rhythm, a calm logic woven into everything. They called it logos, a word that would later echo in both philosophy and religion. But for them, it wasn't an abstract concept. It was the feeling that the world, despite its noise, still makes sense if you listen long enough. Zeno's own life became a quiet lesson in endurance. He taught for decades, modestly dressed, refusing wealth or luxury. One story says that when he was offered citizenship and a gold crown for his wisdom, he smiled and declined both. He lived simply and died quietly, an ending so uneventful that it became the perfect Stoic death. His followers, though, carried his ideas far beyond Athens. They weren't scholars so much as travellers, spreading the porch philosophy across the Mediterranean. It found its way to Rome, where it would shape emperors, soldiers, and philosophers for centuries. But at the start, it was just this: a man who lost everything and refused to be broken by it. There's something oddly comforting in that story. History is full of conquerors and kings, but here was a man who conquered himself and found that it was enough. If you close your eyes, you can almost see the scene: the Athenian sunlight reflecting off white stone, the murmur of the market, the soft sound of sandals on marble. A small crowd gathers beneath painted columns. Zeno speaks quietly, his voice steady. Around him, the noise of trade and gossip fades to a kind of background rhythm. He gestures to the world beyond the porch, to the chaos of life, and says in essence, "You don't control that, but you control how you walk through it." It's remarkable how that simple idea survived empires, crusades, and centuries of confusion. It outlasted gods and kingdoms because it offered something universal, a way to find steadiness when everything else tilts. If you've ever endured a loss, faced something unfair, or waited for calm that never came, you've already practiced Stoicism without knowing it. It's there in the deep breath before speaking, in the choice to let an insult go, in the small act of refusing despair. Zeno would have recognized it instantly. As our story drifts forward, the porch will fill with new voices, disciples who refined his ideas, each shaping them for a different kind of struggle. But the heart of it remains the same. You can't control the sea, only the sail. And as the sunlight fades on that painted porch, the marketplace grows quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a wind shifts, carrying the faint scent of olive wood and salt. The man who once lost everything has taught others how not to lose themselves. Our quiet exploration now turns from Zeno's beginnings to those who carried his torch. Men who found through labour and logic that peace of mind requires as much work as any craft. If Zeno built the foundation of Stoicism, it was Cleanthes who strengthened its walls. He was the quiet kind of student, the one who listens more than he speaks, the one who outlives his teacher simply by refusing to stop trying. Cleanthes wasn't born to philosophy. He was a boxer, a labourer, and a water carrier in Athens. By day, he hauled heavy jars from the wells. By night, he studied under Zeno's porch until his eyes blurred in the lamplight. He earned almost nothing, but his persistence became legendary. The people of Athens called him the well-digger of wisdom. The name fit him perfectly: slow, steady, and deeply patient. If Zeno taught how to steer the ship, Cleanthes taught how to row it. For him, philosophy wasn't an escape from labour. It was labour itself, done with dignity. He believed that hard work and contemplation were not opposites, but partners. When asked how he found time to think while carrying water, he simply said, "I think with my hands." Cleanthes' version of Stoicism was less intellectual and more practical. He didn't write many books. He lived his ideas instead. He spoke about the order of nature, the rhythm that runs through all things, the stars, the tides, the growth of a tree, all part of one great harmony. He believed that this harmony was divine, not as a person or a god sitting in judgment, but as a vast intelligence that breathes through everything. He described the universe as a single living being, and humans as its reasoning organs. To live according to nature meant to act in ways that kept this organism healthy. Anger, greed, or vanity were like fevers of the soul, disturbances that clouded reason. Calmness was the cure. When he wasn't hauling water, Cleanthes wrote hymns, simple poems of gratitude to the divine pattern of the world. One of them, the Hymn to Zeus, still survives. It praises the universe not with flattery, but with awe. In it he writes of the law that binds the stars and the hearts of men alike. You can almost hear his rough hands setting the jar down, his voice rising softly in the night air. It's strange, but comforting, that such serenity came from someone who knew exhaustion better than luxury. Cleanthes wasn't detached from the world, he was fully within it, and that's what made his calm so believable. He taught that philosophy wasn't about retreating to a mountaintop. It was about finding clarity in the marketplace, peace in the noise, patience in the queue. His most famous student, Chrysippus, took those ideas and built them into a system so detailed that even the gods might have needed an index. If Cleanthes was the heart of Stoicism, Chrysippus was its architecture. He wrote hundreds of books, organised logic into diagrams, and turned moral guidance into something close to science. He argued that every statement has a truth value, either true or false, and that the wise person must learn to tell the difference not only in argument, but in emotion. Jealousy, for example, comes from believing someone else's happiness diminishes your own. The moment you see that belief as false, jealousy dissolves. Logic, he said, isn't just for speech, it's for sanity. He also developed what he called appropriate actions, small, rational steps one can take toward virtue, even without reaching perfection. It was an encouraging thought, that wisdom wasn't a mountain you had to climb in one day, but a path you could walk every morning. Chrysippus wasn't humorless, though his reputation as a scholar sometimes makes him sound that way. Ancient writers joked that he could debate himself into a circle and still win. When asked why he wrote so much, he reportedly smiled and said, "So that others might stop writing nonsense." Philosophers, it seems, have always been familiar with sarcasm. His approach made Stoicism both precise and flexible. It could apply to sailors and senators alike, to rich and poor, because it spoke to what was universal, the mind's ability to choose its response. You can't control a storm, but you can choose whether to panic. You can't control an insult, but you can decide if it deserves to stay in your head. For Chrysippus, logic was armour against chaos. If you picture the two men together, Cleanthes with his calloused hands and quiet faith, Chrysippus with his sharp quill and restless intellect, you can see why Stoicism endured. It had both labour and logic, both heart and structure. It taught that calm isn't passive and that understanding isn't detached. Their lessons still sound familiar today. Every time someone says, "Focus on what you can control," they're echoing Zeno. Every time someone takes a deep breath before responding, they're channeling Cleanthes. Every time someone rewires their thoughts to challenge fear or anger, they're practicing Chrysippus's logic without realizing it. Together, these men turned loss into philosophy, work into wisdom, and argument into therapy. Their message was simple, though not easy. Life will always test you, but how you answer the test is what defines you. In the evenings, when the marketplace of Athens grew quiet, the students of the Stoa would light small lamps and gather beneath the columns. The scent of oil and dust filled the air. Cleanthes would speak softly about patience. Chrysippus would sketch a diagram in the sand to prove that virtue had no contradictions. Above them, the stars shone in mathematical silence. To them, it wasn't a sky of chaos. It was proof that reason ran through everything, even the hearts of tired men trying to be good. As the lamps burned low, the porch would empty. The night breeze carried away their voices, but not their ideas. Those ideas would travel across seas and centuries, finding new students in distant lands, soldiers, poets, emperors, all searching for the same thing, a calm centre in a turbulent world. And as our journey continues, we follow those voices across the sea to the empire that adopted Stoicism not as theory but as survival. Rome, with its marble temples, roaring crowds, and fragile peace, was about to meet a philosophy that could outlast its own legions. By the time Stoicism reached Rome, it had already lost its sandals and put on a toga. What began as a humble philosophy under a painted porch in Athens became, in the hands of Romans, a guidebook for living through chaos. It was no longer just a method of reasoning, it was a way to survive power, politics, and the peculiar loneliness of command. Rome was a city built on noise and ambition. Marble temples gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, while markets buzzed with rumour and argument. Soldiers marched, senators schemed, emperors dreamed of eternity and then died like everyone else. Amid all this grandeur, Stoicism offered a whisper: control yourself, not the world. 3 figures would define its Roman age: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. They couldn't have been more different. One rich, one enslaved, one crowned. Together, they proved that Stoicism was less about circumstance and more about composure. Seneca was the philosopher of contradiction. He preached modesty while living in luxury, advised emperors while fearing them, and wrote about calm while living in a world that refused to sit still. He served as tutor and later advisor to Nero, a man whose hobbies included setting cities on fire and executing mentors. Seneca's letters are full of weary wisdom, as if written by someone trying to talk sense into a thunderstorm. Anger, he wrote, is temporary madness. He advised patience, forgiveness, and the slow art of self-control. Yet he spent his life surrounded by people who mistook cruelty for strength. In one of his letters, he admits the contradiction. I preach virtue while I am still a slave to luxury. That honesty is why his words still sound human. He wasn't pretending to be perfect. He was trying to stay sane in a palace that rewarded insanity. When Nero finally ordered his death, Seneca obeyed calmly. He opened his veins as the custom dictated and continued a philosophical conversation with his friends while the blood drained from his body. It's an image both horrifying and oddly peaceful. A man proving that serenity isn't something the world can grant or take away. If Seneca represents Stoicism under power, Epictetus represents it under powerlessness. Born into slavery, he owned nothing, not even himself. But through study and reflection, he discovered a freedom his masters couldn't touch. "You may chain my leg," he told one of them, "but not my will." Epictetus had a limp for most of his life, a reminder of cruelty he never avenged. Instead, he turned it into a metaphor. The world, he said, will always test you. You can't choose the trials, but you can choose the response. What upsets people is not things themselves, he wrote, but the judgments they make about them. His teachings were collected by his student Arian in a small book simply called the Handbook. It's less a treatise than a toolbox, a set of reminders for anyone trying to keep their mind steady in a trembling world. Among his most famous lines, "When you're about to take offence, remember, you're not compelled to be offended." He believed that freedom begins not with rebellion, but with restraint. It's hard not to see how this philosophy took root in the empire. Rome was full of things you couldn't control: politics, gossip, plague, taxes, emperors. Stoicism offered a quiet alternative to despair. It told people they could be at peace even in chains, even in chaos. Then came Marcus Aurelius, the emperor-philosopher, the man who ruled the known world but wrote like a student still trying to understand himself. His meditations were never meant for publication. They were personal notes, written during sleepless nights on military campaigns, somewhere between rain and candlelight. In them, he scolds himself for pride, reminds himself to be kind, and thanks the universe for existing at all. "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be," he writes. "Be one." There's no poetry there, only clarity. He calls the mind a fortress that cannot be breached without consent. He reminds himself daily that people will be selfish, cruel, and foolish, and that he must love them anyway. Imagine him in his tent, the emperor of a vast empire surrounded by soldiers and uncertainty. Outside, thunder rolls across the Danube frontier. Inside, the world's most powerful man dips his pen in ink and writes reminders to himself about humility. That image alone explains why Stoicism endured. It isn't about power, it's about proportion, about keeping your humanity in a system designed to strip it away. What connects these three men, the wealthy, the enslaved, the emperor, is not circumstance but choice. Each discovered that control begins where panic ends. Each learned to measure success not in victories but in composure. They lived through violence, greed, and fear, and yet their words are filled not with bitterness but with patience. Stoicism didn't erase emotion, it refined it. It asked you to feel without drowning, to act without anger, to accept without surrender. It didn't demand that you be unshakable. It asked only that you shake with purpose. The world hasn't changed as much as we like to think. We still face the same tests: power, fear, loss, frustration. Only now they come with email notifications. The Stoics would recognize our anxiety instantly. They'd probably tell us to put down the phone, breathe, and remember that very little is truly under our control, except the breath itself. So from a broken philosopher, a freed slave, and a weary emperor, we inherit a strange kind of hope. Not that the world will ever be peaceful, but that we might learn to be. The calm they describe isn't a gift from life, it's a skill for surviving it. As night falls over Rome, you can picture the three of them as echoes in time: Seneca writing by lamplight, Epictetus teaching in a small courtyard, Marcus Aurelius whispering notes to himself in the dark. Different lives, same struggle. The city outside roars, but inside each of them a small silence endures. If we follow that silence further, it leads us from the marble palaces of emperors to stone cloisters of monks. Because when Rome fell, the philosophy of the porch didn't die. It simply changed its robes and learned to pray. When Rome finally fell, its noise did not go quietly. Temples were emptied, libraries burned, and marble crumbled into dust that peasants would later use to build barns. But ideas, the softer things, are harder to kill. The Stoics had taught calm, discipline, and moderation, and those lessons found new homes. They slipped quietly from the forum to the monastery. In a sense, the philosophy of the porch simply changed its furniture. The same principles that once echoed under painted columns now whispered through stone corridors. The Romans had sought peace amid politics. The monks sought it amid silence. Both were chasing the same stillness, the one that survives noise. Monasteries rose like islands after a flood. The world outside was collapsing. Wars, famine, chaos. And inside, men and women built tiny worlds of order. They woke before dawn, prayed by candlelight, ate in silence, and copied books letter by letter. In those cold rooms, Stoicism's old ideas put on new robes. What had been philosophy became faith. The Stoic call for temperance became fasting. The virtue of endurance became asceticism. Reflection turned into prayer. Even their vocabulary overlapped. The Stoics spoke of living according to nature. The monks spoke of obedience to God's will. Both were really saying the same thing: accept what you cannot change and master what you can. It wasn't a clean transfer of knowledge, of course. Few monks would have called themselves philosophers. But many of the texts they copied and studied, the letters of Seneca, fragments of Epictetus, survived precisely because a silent scribe thought they were worth preserving. One philosopher's scroll became a monk's manuscript, and an ancient whisper became a medieval chant. Picture the setting: a narrow cell lined with stone, a desk of rough wood, a single candle flickering beside a jar of ink. Outside, wind presses against the walls. Inside, a monk dips his quill, breathes softly, and writes the same word 3 times to be sure it's perfect. He doesn't know he's keeping philosophy alive. He's just following the rhythm of discipline, the same rhythm that Zeno once taught on his porch. There's a kind of beauty in that accident. Wisdom preserved not by ambition, but by routine. The Stoics had always warned against pride. Fitting, then, that their survival depended on humility. The monks didn't debate the meaning of calm, they lived it. Their silence was its own argument. Over the centuries, that discipline became the architecture of monastic life. Time itself was divided into ordered intervals. Matins before sunrise, vespers at dusk. Bells mark the hours not for commerce, but for contemplation. The Stoics had measured the day by rational purpose. The monks measured it by prayer. But both sought to keep chaos outside the door. Fasting served a similar purpose. To eat less was not just penance. It was proof of control. Hunger, like anger, could be endured. To feel it and remain calm was a small triumph of spirit over flesh. The Stoics would have recognized the logic immediately. They too had preached that discomfort is temporary, but dignity is permanent. Even confession, that uniquely Christian ritual, had echoes of Stoic introspection. Seneca once wrote that every night before sleeping he reviewed his actions and asked himself what he had done well, what he had done poorly, and what he could change tomorrow. Centuries later, monks did the same. Only now the conversation had an audience in heaven. The practice remained the same: know yourself, forgive yourself, and try again. There were, of course, differences. The Stoics sought self-mastery for its own sake. The monks sought it for God's sake. But the tools were identical: solitude, moderation, thought. The porch and the cloister were 2 sides of the same coin, both trying to build peace in a world allergic to it. The humour, if there is any, lies in the setting. The Stoa of Athens had sunlight, laughter, and sea breeze. The monastery had none of those. Its air smelled of wax and damp linen, its floors were cold stone, and its music was repetition. One might say philosophy found its afterlife in a colder climate. The porch became a monastery with worse heating, and yet even here warmth survived. Not from fire, but from purpose. Each monk's quiet breath was a small defiance against despair. In an age when so much knowledge was vanishing, they kept copying, praying, and thinking. The Stoics would have smiled at that. Not the prayer itself, but the perseverance behind it. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The faint scrape of a quill, the low hum of voices in prayer, the rhythm of a life reduced to essentials. There's a kind of courage in that simplicity, to live without distraction, to sit alone with your thoughts, to endure boredom without reaching for noise. That's not far from philosophy. It's just philosophy practiced with a rosary. As centuries passed, this borrowed calm shaped the entire rhythm of European life. The monastic clocks that rang through abbeys would later give us modern hours, schedules, and timekeeping. Even the idea of quiet reflection before action, now part of therapy, education, and daily mindfulness, was born in those cells of stone. What the monks preserved wasn't just ancient words. They preserved the habit of pausing before speaking. So much of our civilization began that way, by accident, by persistence, by someone quietly choosing order over chaos. The Stoics taught how to be calm. The monks built spaces where calm could live. And from those cloisters, the idea would wander back into the world centuries later, when people once again found themselves surrounded by noise. As we drift forward through time, that noise grows louder. Printing presses, carriages, factories, machines, and finally the digital hum of our own age. But the advice remains the same as it was beneath the painted porch. Breathe, observe, act with reason. The robes may have changed, the language softened, but the wisdom still stands. And if we follow that thread into our own century, we find Stoicism once again rising from the page, this time through screens, speakers, and late-night podcasts. The ancient discipline returns, a quiet rebellion against the volume of modern life. If you sit quietly in the evening, screen dimmed, phone face down, and hear the low hum of the modern world, the tick of a clock, the thrum of traffic, the distant buzz of a fridge, you might think peace is something we've lost. But it's still here. It's simply buried under notifications. The Stoics, if they walked into this century, would be both impressed and horrified. They would marvel at airplanes and vaccines, then watch a person panic over a slow Wi-Fi connection and shake their heads. You have conquered disease and distance, they might say, but not your own impatience. And they would be right. We live in a world louder than any marketplace Rome ever knew. Every scroll, every ping, every headline tells us what to feel before we even have the chance to decide. Yet, quietly, almost secretly, Stoicism has returned, not as an ancient relic, but as a coping mechanism. It began, fittingly, in the 20th century when philosophers like Pierre Hadot reminded readers that philosophy wasn't meant to be homework. It was meant to be a way of living. He described Stoicism as spiritual exercise, less lecture, more daily practice. Think of it as the gym of the mind, simple movements, repeated often until calm becomes muscle memory. Around the same time, psychologists began to rediscover the same logic in their own language. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or simply thinking practice, as a Stoic might have called it, rests on an old truth. Your thoughts shape your emotions. Change the pattern, and the feeling follows. Marcus Aurelius would have nodded in agreement. The soul, he once wrote, becomes dyed with the colour of its thoughts. In the past few decades, that old porch philosophy has found new walls. Office cubicles, classrooms, even podcasts whispered into sleepless ears. The advice hasn't changed much. Control what you can, accept what you can't, and stop arguing with reality. It sounds simple, but simplicity rarely feels easy. Today's Stoics are not toga-wearing sages, but people juggling emails, deadlines, and family texts. They quote ancient lines between coffee sips. They highlight passages from the Meditations while waiting for meetings to load. They call it mindfulness, self-help, mental resilience, all modern labels for the same idea. Peace through perspective. If you walk through a city at night, you might see them. faces lit by blue light, scrolling through chaos and looking for calm. Some read Epictetus on their phones. Some listen to recorded affirmations about serenity. One YouTube channel quotes Seneca in subtitles while showing ocean waves. It's strange and a little funny, this revival of ancient discipline through fibre optics. The algorithm preaches self-control between cat videos, but maybe that's exactly how philosophy survives, by adapting to whatever noise surrounds it. The Stoics never asked for silence, they asked for steadiness. You can be calm in a crowd, they said, as long as you remember that your thoughts are your own. In that sense, the modern world is the ultimate Stoic training ground. Every notification is a chance to practice indifference. Every argument online is an opportunity to choose restraint, and yet, even now, the struggle is the same one Zeno faced after his shipwreck. The sea has changed form, from waves to data, but it still tests our balance. We chase certainty, pleasure, distraction, and find ourselves exhausted. Then, somewhere in that exhaustion, the old Stoic voice reappears. You control the sail, not the wind. If you sit with that idea long enough, it starts to reshape everything. Anxiety becomes weather, anger becomes thunder, noisy but passing. Peace, it turns out, isn't a permanent state but a repeated decision, made one breath at a time. In many ways, the modern rediscovery of Stoicism mirrors what the monks did 1,000 years ago. The tools have changed. Phones instead of prayer beads, apps instead of scriptures. But the goal is identical, to find stillness in motion. We build digital monasteries now, playlists for focus, breathing exercises on screens, short meditations disguised as productivity hacks. We are busier than ever, and yet we long for the same quiet that echoed under ancient stone. The humour in all this is how endlessly human it is. The Stoics wanted to rise above emotion, but even they would have smiled at our efforts. We seek calm the way a cat chases a shadow, aware of its futility, yet unable to stop. But perhaps the effort itself is the point. In the end, the essence of Stoicism hasn't changed at all. It's not about rejecting the world, but living wisely within it. It's not about detachment, but proportion, knowing what deserves your energy and what doesn't. Every time you choose not to reply to an insult, not to panic at the news, not to measure your worth by strangers' approval, you're standing on the same porch as Zeno, just with better shoes. So, as the night stretches deeper and the glow of the screen fades, think of this. The search for calm is the one inheritance that never decays. It passed from Athens to Rome, from parchment to paper, from monks to modern minds. It endures because chaos endures. Outside your window, the world keeps humming. Traffic, devices, distant laughter. Inside, you breathe. That simple act is still the oldest philosophy of all. And if we follow that breath a little further, it leads us from the calm of thought back to the warmth of the body, to another Roman legacy, where peace wasn't found in silence or logic, but in water, heat, and the strange civility of shared steam. If philosophy was Rome's way of cleansing the mind, bathing was how it cleansed everything else. It wasn't simply hygiene, it was a civic event, a daily performance of wellness and status. You didn't bathe alone, you bathed with everyone else, senators, merchants, soldiers, poets, and the occasional pickpocket pretending to be cultured. The Romans didn't invent the bath, but they turned it into an art form. Step by step, they built it into a ritual as deliberate as a prayer. A proper bathhouse could rival a palace in size and beauty. Marble floors gleamed under sunlight filtering through high arches. Water dripped rhythmically from bronze spouts. The air shimmered with steam and the smell of warm oil. You would start in the apoditerium, the changing room. It was lined with niches for clothing and guarded by slaves, who sometimes watched your belongings less carefully than they watched your jewellery. Conversations began here, usually about politics, gossip, or which general had embarrassed himself most recently. From there, you entered the tepidarium, the warm room. Its heat eased you into the rhythm of the day, loosening muscles and tempers alike. People chatted, compared notes, and pretended not to notice who had gained weight or lost favour. Then came the caldarium, the hot room, a humid chamber with a large marble basin filled with steaming water. This was where the real Roman meditation began. Men sat shoulder to shoulder on stone benches, their skin glistening, their thoughts dissolving in the heat. The air vibrated with echoes, whispers, sighs, the splash of ladles pouring warm water over bare skin. The heat softened everything: muscle, memory, ambition. And just when you began to feel entirely human again, it was time for the frigidarium, the cold plunge. The shock was violent but exhilarating. The Romans believed it sealed the body, locking in vitality. It was also the perfect cure for arrogance. No matter your rank, everyone gasped the same way when they hit cold water. Afterward came scraping and oiling. A servant or friend, or sometimes both, used a curved metal tool called a strigil to remove the sweat, dust and oil that clung to the skin. The sound of metal against flesh was strangely soothing, like polishing marble. It left the body gleaming, smooth, and faintly scented with olive oil. All this took time. A serious bath could last hours, because it wasn't just about washing, it was about resetting. It was exercise, therapy, networking, and gossip all at once. Wellness before Wi-Fi, as we might call it now. The bathhouse itself was a masterpiece of engineering and architecture. Heated floors, vaulted ceilings, and clever use of natural light made the experience feel half divine. The warmth wasn't accidental. Beneath the marble ran channels of hot air, fed by furnaces outside the walls. The result was a perfectly controlled environment, a kind of man-made climate. Rome's quiet proof that civilization could master even the elements. The daily routine of bathing gave the city its rhythm. The poor might use smaller public baths, the wealthy their private ones, but everyone followed the same sequence. Afternoon was the most popular hour, when the work of the day was done and the city smelled faintly of soap and ambition. Steam curled into the air like incense, turning ordinary citizens into temporary gods of relaxation. Inscriptions on the walls advised moderation: enter clean of mind as well as body. The phrase could have been written by a Stoic. Cleanliness, after all, was as much moral as physical. A hot bath was the closest thing Rome had to therapy. Arguments cooled faster in steam. Enemies, stripped of their armour and rank, looked suddenly human. Perhaps that was the real genius of Roman bathing. It made equality feel possible, at least until everyone dried off. Of course, not all baths were serene. Some were noisy, crowded, and chaotic. Juvenal, the poet, complained about the endless chatter of barbers and the splash of fools. Others worried about what went on behind curtained alcoves. The moralists of Rome always had a list of concerns: mixed bathing, flirtations, political plotting, stolen clothes. But none of it stopped the crowds. The bath was simply too good to give up. It was also practical. The water helped fight the dust of the city, the heat soothed old injuries, and the social life lubricated every level of society. Deals were made in steam. Friendships were sealed with laughter over a shared towel. The bathhouse was where Rome reminded itself that life, for all its discipline and duty, could still feel pleasant. When you imagine it, don't think of it as luxury. Think of it as rhythm. The sound of dripping water, the low hum of voices, the slap of sandals on wet stone, all of it blending into something hypnotic. The Romans called it otium, a kind of restful leisure that restored the mind. They didn't see it as idleness, but balance. To work without otium was to grind oneself into dust. And so, every afternoon, the city exhaled. The forges cooled, the markets emptied, and thousands of Romans made their way toward warmth and water. It was as much a civic duty as a pleasure, a daily renewal of body and spirit. The philosophers could talk about reason and virtue. The engineers simply built them out of steam. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel it. The soft light through mist, the echo of laughter across marble, the sudden chill of the plunge. It's easy to forget that this was a civilization obsessed not only with conquest, but with comfort. The Romans wanted to conquer the world, but also to make sure it smelled nice afterward. As the steam rises and the day slows, the bath becomes more than a room. It's a sanctuary, a pause between ambition and exhaustion. In that warmth, the empire's noise quiets for a moment, and all that's left is the simple pleasure of being alive. The path now carries us toward the fire beneath this calm, the hidden system that made all this possible. Because under the marble floors and polite conversation, the bathhouse had a secret heart, a furnace that breathed like a beast, heating the empire from below. If you'd walked barefoot across a Roman bathhouse floor, you might have wondered how the marble stayed so perfectly warm. No fire was visible, no smoke, no soot, just steady heat, rising through the stone like a quiet pulse. It felt almost supernatural. But beneath that calm was a monster, a furnace fed day and night, breathing fire through the bones of the building. The Romans called it the hypocaust, a word meaning heat from below. It was, in every sense, ancient central heating. Picture a great tiled room floating above a hollow space, supported by dozens of short brick pillars. Through that space, hot air from a nearby furnace would flow, warming the floor above it. The heat would rise into the walls through flues, narrow clay pipes that carried warmth upward, turning the entire structure into a single, gentle radiator. The system was genius in its simplicity. A furnace burned wood or charcoal at one end of the complex. Slaves, usually strong and unlucky, tended it constantly, shoveling fuel, fanning flames and scraping ash. The fire needed to breathe, just enough to send its heat into the network of channels. The floor above could reach 40 degrees Celsius, or in gentler words, the temperature of a very determined summer afternoon. To the people bathing above, it was comfort incarnate. They never saw the labour or the engineering. They only felt the miracle of warm marble beneath their feet and mist curling softly through the air. It was architecture disguised as grace. Roman engineers adored control over water, heat, time, even air. The hypocaust was their quiet proof that civilization could command the elements. No other culture of the ancient world managed to tame warmth so elegantly. Other civilizations prayed for fire, the Romans installed it. But it wasn't only about comfort, it was also about prestige. A well-heated bathhouse was a symbol of a city's wealth and discipline. To keep one running required organisation, a team of firekeepers, water carriers, masons and cleaners. The system was fragile. One blocked flue or damp pile of fuel could cool an entire complex. Yet the Romans made it look effortless. Every bathhouse had its own personality. Some were intimate and modest, others vast and theatrical. The great baths of Caracalla in Rome could host thousands of people. Beneath their marble floors, entire corridors of brick columns carried heat through the building. You could hear the faint hiss and crackle below, the sound of an empire breathing. The water itself was another marvel. Aqueducts carried it from distant springs, flowing steadily through stone channels at precise angles. The gradient had to be perfect, just enough slope for gravity to do the work. To modern ears, that might sound simple, but across dozens of miles the margin for error was the thickness of a fingernail. The engineers worked with a precision that still humbles us. They had no pumps, no electricity, no blueprints, just math, patience, and the quiet belief that water should obey geometry. The result was astonishing. A city like Rome had enough aqueducts to supply baths, fountains, homes, and gardens, all running on nothing but gravity. Water entered the bath complex hot and left it steaming into the streets, where children played in the runoff. Civilization, in this sense, was literally warmed from the ground up. Standing inside one of these structures today, you can still feel that design. The ruins hold heat even in shadow. The air seems to remember the fires that once roared beneath. You can trace the flues along the walls, little ghost veins of an ancient circulatory system. The architecture wasn't just functional, it was anatomical. The building lived and breathed, and perhaps that's why the Romans loved it so much. The bathhouse was a living metaphor for the empire itself, powerful, ordered, and fueled by unseen labour. The comfort of the few rested on the work of the many. Slaves fed the fire, builders cut the stone, engineers measured the flow. Yet above it all, senators reclined in luxury, discussing politics as if the warmth appeared by divine decree. There's something both beautiful and tragic about that. A society so good at controlling nature, yet so indifferent to the people who made it possible. The hippocaust hummed like a heart, steady and invisible, reminding everyone that Rome's genius was as much about illusion as invention. Still, it's hard not to admire the craft. Imagine walking through the caldarium, the hot chamber, with its floor softly glowing from beneath. Steam rises, light reflects off damp marble, and you feel a heat that seems to come from the gods themselves. Yet you know, somewhere below, there's just fire, ash, and men too tired to look up. That balance between splendour and struggle runs through all of Roman history. The empire was built on dualities: luxury and labour, order and exploitation, art and ash. The baths captured all of it in miniature. They were places of equality in theory. Anyone could enter, stripped of rank, but also places that reminded you who kept the fires burning. Still, when you stand among the ruins now, you can't help but feel awe rather than judgment. The Romans built warmth that outlived them. Their cities fell, their gods faded, but their plumbing still works. Archaeologists have found bathhouses so intact that, with a little fuel, the hippocaust could still breathe again. It's tempting to think of this as just ancient luxury, but it was also a philosophy in brick, a belief that comfort was a sign of civilization. To make life a little warmer, a little easier, was to prove that reason could conquer chaos. As the evening cooled over the empire, smoke from the furnaces would drift into the twilight, painting the sky with soft streaks of grey. Inside, the last bathers lingered in the heat, reluctant to leave. Beneath them, the hippocaust whispered its steady exhale, the sound of a world that believed warmth could be built, maintained, and for a time, shared. Our quiet exploration now turns from the machinery beneath the marble to the life that unfolded above it. The chatter, the politics, and the strange democracy of steam that made Rome's bathhouses more than buildings. They were the empire's living rooms, its rumour mills, its therapy sessions conducted in towels and mist. If the hippocaust was the hidden heart of Rome's bathhouses, the steam above it was the empire's mind, full of conversation, speculation, and the kind of gossip that could move armies. In the hot mist, rank blurred and tongues loosened. The bath wasn't just a place to cleanse the body, it was where the city cleaned its conscience, one rumour at a time. The moment you stepped through the marble archway, the air wrapped around you like a damp cloak. The sound came next, a symphony of splashes, laughter, and debate echoing off the walls. Steam softened the light, turning faces into ghosts and whispers into secrets. The baths were Rome's social media. Centuries before anyone invented the scroll, deals were made, scandals were born, and friendships were negotiated between the tepidarium and the cold plunge. In the caldarium, senators soaked beside soldiers, artists shared benches with merchants, philosophers with courtesans. Stripped of armour, silk, and titles, everyone looked equally human, an illusion that lasted only until someone opened their mouth. Then the hierarchy reappeared in the form of conversation. Who spoke first? Who listened? Who dared to interrupt? You could overhear almost anything. Politics, of course. Always politics. Did you hear what the consul said about the grain tax? Do you think the emperor's new wife is plotting against him? The walls of a Roman bath heard more state secrets than any Senate chamber, and unlike senators, the walls never repeated them. There was also the chatter of the everyday, who was marrying whom, whose villa had the better mosaic, whose horse had finally won a race after 6 humiliating losses. The topics changed, but the tone didn't. Even in an empire, gossip was the great equalizer. No matter your status, someone was probably discussing your haircut. Poets came for inspiration, lawyers came for clients, doctors came to advertise their lotions. Everyone came to be seen, and everyone pretended they weren't looking. Steam was flattering. It blurred flaws, hid age, and made ambition glisten. The bath was the one place where Rome's elite could appear natural, though nothing about it was accidental. It wasn't all talk. Some came for exercise before bathing, lifting weights, or wrestling in the palestra, the open-air courtyard. Others played games, ball, dice, or the ancient version of chess, though most games ended in the same way, someone accusing someone else of cheating. Then came laughter, argument, and occasionally a splash loud enough to end the discussion. But the real sport was conversation. Cicero once said that no Roman truly bathed alone, even when the room was empty. The mind always brought company. The bathhouse was where reputations were built and destroyed in equal measure. You could enter a respected man and leave a cautionary tale. Humour too thrived in the heat. The Romans loved irony, especially at their own expense. A popular saying warned, "What is whispered in steam will echo in marble," meaning nothing stays secret for long. Another went, "To bathe with friends is to risk knowing them." Beneath the laughter was recognition, the understanding that public life was a performance, and everyone was both actor and audience. Even the architecture encouraged this theatre. The marble benches curved in semicircles, drawing people together. The air shimmered, distorting faces and giving every gesture a dreamlike exaggeration. You might swear that someone smiled at you, only to realise it was the reflection of steam in your eyes. The whole experience was a dance between clarity and illusion, much like Rome itself. Business thrived here too. Merchants negotiated contracts, generals recruited investors, and philosophers courted patrons. The baths were where ideas circulated along with gossip, a living network of commerce and thought. More than one policy began in steam and ended in marble proclamation. One historian even claimed that emperors judged the mood of the people by eavesdropping in the bath. If they complain while sweating, he wrote, they will revolt when cold. But amid all the chatter, there was something healing about it. For a society built on duty and hierarchy, the baths provided a rare pause, a place where men and women, rich and poor, shared the same air. The heat erased sharp edges. The water equalized posture. Here, even the proudest Roman was reminded that sweat smells democratic. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists like Seneca complained that the noise of the baths ruined meditation. He described the chorus, the slap of hands during massages, the squeak of strigils scraping oil from skin, the cries of athletes, and worst of all, the splash of those who jumped into the pool as if diving were a virtue. Yet even he admitted that the bath was necessary. "We wash away dust," he wrote, "and perhaps some sorrow." Women's baths had their own atmosphere, less public, but no less alive. There were perfumes, gossip, and occasionally debates as fierce as any Senate argument. While the male elite discussed empire, the women discussed survival, husbands, childbirth, fashion, and faith. It was a quieter but no less essential network, a steam-filled council of practical wisdom. If you stood back and listened to it all, the murmurs, the laughter, the splashes, you might realise the bathhouse was less a building and more a portrait of Rome itself. It was vast, sophisticated, and slightly absurd. It celebrated comfort while hiding labour, order while breeding rumour. It was the empire in miniature, strong, beautiful, and constantly talking about itself. When evening came, the steam thinned and the noise softened. Attendants swept the floors, collected towels, and poured cool water over the marble to settle the heat. Outside, the city still roared, but inside, for a moment, there was calm. The last bathers lingered, speaking in whispers, their faces glowing faintly from the warmth. Somewhere in the mist, a senator laughed too loudly at a joke he didn't quite understand, and a poet quietly noted it down for future use. Rome's Twitter, more steam, fewer filters. As the doors closed and the fires dimmed, the bathhouse exhaled its final sigh of the day. The water stilled, the echoes faded, and what remained was a sense of peace that no speech or law could enforce. The kind that happens when people, stripped of armour and agenda, remember they are simply human. Our journey now drifts from gossip and laughter towards something quieter. The baths not as spectacle, but as sanctuary, a place where health, medicine and philosophy met in the warm shimmer of marble. The Romans never separated health from habit. To them, medicine wasn't confined to scrolls or herbs, it was built into the rhythm of daily life, into food, exercise, air, and above all water. The bathhouse was their pharmacy, their clinic, and sometimes their therapy room. Beneath the laughter and gossip, you could hear a quieter intention, the pursuit of balance. Roman physicians didn't talk about cells or microbes. Their world was described in music, not chemistry. They believed the body was composed of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. You didn't need to memorise the names. What mattered was the melody. When the 4 played in harmony, you were healthy. When one went off tune, you were not. The doctor's job was to conduct the orchestra back to balance. The baths, in this philosophy, were more than comfort. They were treatment. Heat loosened the body, water cleansed it, and rest restored its rhythm. To step into steam was to tune yourself again, not with science as we know it, but with instinct and patience. A typical Roman wellness routine might begin in the palestra, the open-air gym attached to the baths. There you'd stretch, lift hand weights, or throw a discus that was always slightly heavier than you remembered. The goal wasn't vanity, but circulation. A Stoic would have approved. Discipline in motion, virtue measured in sweat. After exercise came the warm rooms, the tepidarium and caldarium, where heat drew out what the physicians called impurities. Then came massage, using oil scented with rosemary, mint, or crushed myrtle. The masseur's hands moved like sculptors over clay, kneading stiffness into stillness. And then, when the body was supple and the mind calm, came the cold plunge, the frigidarium, the shock that made the heart remember it was alive. Romans swore it improved the circulation of both blood and optimism. A physician named Celsus even prescribed cold water as a cure for melancholy. "If sorrow persists," he wrote, "bathe and begin again." In a way, that sentence captures Roman medicine's entire spirit. They didn't chase immortality, they practiced a maintenance. The body was a building to be tended, not a temple to be worshipped. Cracks appeared, repairs were made, and life went on. The great physicians, Galen, Celsus, and their peers, studied anatomy through observation and analogy. They saw the pulse as the city's heartbeat, digestion as a furnace, the brain as the quiet chamber of reason. They lacked microscopes but had imagination. Their metaphors weren't always correct, but they were beautifully human. In the bathhouse, medicine wasn't separate from society. You could visit a physician while reclining in steam, or take advice from a friend who had heard of a remedy that cured a cousin's cousin. Remedies were shared freely. A paste of honey for wounds, garlic for endurance, vinegar for fever, or simply a long nap. Every ailment had a ritual, every ritual a reason. Oils and unguents were everywhere, small jars filled with olive oil infused with herbs, used for both health and vanity. The smell of thyme and myrrh clung to the air like incense. It was as much perfume as prescription. To oil the skin was to protect it, to feed it, to remind yourself that care was part of civilization. And then there was diet. The Romans believed food could heal or harm depending on its temperament. Lentils were calm. Wine, when mixed with water, was moderate. Cheese was risky unless aged. Honey was both sweet and sacred, used for wounds as often as for dessert. Even water had moods. Spring, water invigorated, river water dulled. A physician's advice often sounded more like poetry than instruction. The harmony between body and world mattered most. A Roman would say, "Live according to nature," and mean, "Wake with the light, work with purpose, eat with measure, rest without guilt." Their medicine wasn't just about mending the sick. It was about preventing the imbalance that caused sickness in the first place. There was, of course, superstition. Charms and amulets hung from necks and doors, a bronze hand against the evil eye, a carved phallus for fertility, an inscription asking the gods for health in exchange for small promises. Logic and magic coexisted comfortably. Rome didn't mind contradictions as long as they worked. What's striking is how close their methods still feel. Modern spas still echo Roman habits. Heat, massage, hydration, calm. Doctors still advise exercise and moderation. Even the idea that the mind affects the body, and the body the mind, was already written in marble long before psychology existed. In the quieter corners of the bathhouse, you might find a physician with a tray of instruments, bronze scalpels, bone probes, and small glass jars for leeches. Surgery, when necessary, was blunt but effective. Broken bones were set with splints, wounds stitched with horsehair. Pain was managed with opium, or more often, endurance. The patient's courage was part of the cure, but most Romans preferred prevention to intervention. A day in the bath was worth a week of medicine. As one inscription said, "Balnea, vina, Venus, wash, wine, and love, keep us well." Not perfect advice, but charmingly realistic. By the time the sun set and the last bathers emerged glowing and refreshed, the city itself seemed to hum with health. The steam that rose from the rooftops was like the breath of a single organism. Rome's medicine, for all its errors, understood something profound, that healing is not just about the body's repair, but about the soul's permission to rest. If you stand in the ruins of those baths today, you can still feel it. The calm after warmth, the echo of dripping water, the faint scent of olive oil long since gone. Marble remembers heat the way skin remembers touch. The science may have changed, but the sensation hasn't. And as we follow this steam-scented trail to its end, the story of the Roman bath begins to cool. The fires fade, the water stills, and faith replaces engineering. Because even the cleanest civilization can't resist the chill of time. Every civilization eventually exhales. For Rome, that sigh came slowly, a long, uneven collapse that smelled faintly of smoke, incense, and fading soap. The aqueducts cracked, the furnaces cooled, and the hum of conversation in the bathhouses began to echo through empty halls. Yet the steam lingered, as if refusing to admit the empire was over. In the beginning, it didn't look like decline. The baths still opened at noon, the fires still burned, and the marble still gleamed. But behind the walls, everything was shifting. Maintenance grew harder, taxes grew heavier, slaves escaped or were freed. The wood that once fueled the hypocausts had to be carried from farther and farther away. Eventually, warmth became a luxury again. The Christian era rose as the old gods fell, and with it came a new suspicion of pleasure, especially pleasure that involved nakedness, heat, and laughter. The bathhouse, once a symbol of civilization, began to look, in the eyes of preachers, like temptation carved in stone. They had a point in a way. The baths had always mixed purity with indulgence. For centuries, the same halls that hosted physicians also hosted flirtations. Where one person found peace, another found distraction. The church preferred a simpler order, cleanliness of the soul over cleanliness of the skin. So sermons began to warn that the bath, though warm, might lead to coldness of spirit. Public bathing didn't disappear overnight. It lingered for generations, shrinking from grand marble halls to smaller, plainer rooms. The vast complexes of Caracalla and Diocletian fell into silence, their domes cracked by time. Pigeons nested in the rafters where emperors once bathed. A few fountains still trickled, fed by aqueducts that somehow kept running, the veins of an empire that refused to die completely. But human habits outlived doctrines. People still sought water, warmth, and the small miracle of cleansing. The bath retreated, but it never vanished. In the east, the habit flowed into the Byzantine hammams, and later into the Turkish baths that carried Roman ideas through centuries of Islamic culture. There, the architecture changed, but the soul of it remained. Heat, steam, and the unhurried rhythm of washing as ritual. In medieval Europe, bathing became rarer, but the memory of it never left entirely. Monks built small bathhouses inside monasteries for necessary washing, pretending it was penance rather than pleasure. Travellers along trade routes carried news of distant hot springs said to cure every ache. Even kings built private tubs lined with wood or tin, proof that luxury might be sinful, but sin remained persuasive. By the Renaissance, the bath returned, cautiously at first, then triumphantly. Architects rediscovered the Roman ruins and marvelled at their design. Engineers studied the aqueducts. Artists painted them as symbols of lost perfection, and somewhere in that admiration the old dream rekindled, that civilization meant warmth, water, and company. In truth, Rome never invented bathing, it only perfected it, turning a necessity into a ceremony. That ceremony still travels with us. It's in every shower where the water runs a little longer than needed, every spa where the air smells faintly of eucalyptus, every shared soak where silence replaces conversation. The marble is gone, but the impulse remains. There's something timeless about heat meeting water, about watching steam rise and knowing instinctively that you're safe for a moment. The Romans might have called it luxury, the Stoics balance, and we might call it self-care. Different names, same warmth. And perhaps that's why the bath endured when so many other parts of the empire did not. You can conquer cities, rewrite laws, burn libraries, but people will always need comfort. They will always search for the feeling of being washed clean, not just in body but in mind. If you walk today through the ruins of a Roman bath at dusk, the silence feels alive. Birds roost in the arches. The last light of the sun turns the stone a pale gold. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the echo of dripping water, the faint hum of voices long gone, the soft rush of heat that once pulsed under the floor. It's as if the building itself still breathes, remembering the people who once filled it with laughter and steam. The historian Livy once wrote that Rome taught the world not only how to conquer, but how to live. He didn't mean comfort alone. He meant the art of making daily life feel deliberate. Every bath, every conversation, every shared cup of water was part of that lesson. The empire fell, but its rituals outlived its politics. Even now, in distant hotels, hammams, spas and quiet homes, that legacy continues. Fire heating water, water calming skin, skin remembering warmth. Civilization, it seems, never forgets its most human inventions. The fall of Rome wasn't just the loss of power, it was the cooling of a dream, that the world could be orderly, warm, and kind. Yet the dream didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. The steam that once rose above marble halls still rises today, curling from showers and kettles, softening the air we breathe. The story of Rome's baths is, in the end, the story of comfort itself, how we build it, lose it, and build it again. Beneath every empire's marble lies the same truth. People crave warmth more than glory. And as the last heat fades from the stones and night gathers over the ruins, the steam still drifts upward. A ghost of civilization, still exhaling, still human,